Now it's time to move to f4. 7, f4, that's the main line of Najdorf with bishop g5. Now it's time for black to make a difficult choice. Difficult because there are many options. Black could play bishop e7, which is the main line. It could move its queen. Queen c7 or queen b6, one of the most popular lines recently. Again, promoted in early days by Bobby Fischer. Black could even play knight bd7, and there's even move b5, Pologaevsky variation. And there is a modern attempt, relatively modern attempt, to play knight c6, just changing the character of the game completely. I'll try to show some of the most relevant games in these lines, but again and again I have to warn you, don't use these games and this lecture and this series as an opening encyclopedia. It's more of a presentation. It's for you to enjoy, to be entertained, and if I'm lucky, you will learn something about Najdorf. Let's start with the story that is quite amazing, that if presented in the book, it would be disregarded as non-science fiction. Because one could have hardly imagined that this event, later called an Argentinian tragedy, could have happened in one tournament and in one day. So in mid-50s, strong players in different countries have been analyzing this position quite extensively. And before Interzonal in Gotemburgo in 1955, the Argentinian players, who else? Argentinian players, led by Miguel Najdorf, came up with a new plan. They prepared something that they thought could be a revolutionary and could neutralize f4 once and forever. The line started with bishop e7, and after queen f3, h6, bishop h4, and now g5. Anti-positional, but of course the normal positional rules are not working in Najdorf, as we already know. The idea is that after f takes g5, knight fd7, black is winning the battle for the central square e5. So here is where black knight is going to stay and control the center. If necessary, it could be supported by another knight. Knight can go on c6 from b8, or it could go on d7. Pawn on g5 will be taken. It just takes one move. H takes g5, and then black rook is activated, and after knight e5, white queen has to move somewhere. So from the general perspectives, black's position looks great. It seems that, unless white could manage to create some powerful attack with the next few moves, black's strategical plan will succeed. It did occur that in one day, 3 Argentinian players faced 3 Soviet players. There were 3 games. Najdorf carries Pilnik, Spassky, and Pano Geller. In fact, the Soviet players had white. So we should rather say Geller, Pano, Keres, Najdorf, and Spassky, Pilnik. And all Argentinian players picked up this line. They probably expected that it's a brand new line, which was brand new at that time, could have devastating effect on Soviet players. But in fact, it was other way around. All Soviet players in this position made a move that was not expected by their Argentinian counterparts. Knight takes e6. So, looks dangerous at first sight. F takes e6, queen h5, king f8. And now we're probably not in Najdorf anymore, but in the king's gambit, because black king goes on f8, and it just takes one check from f1. Just, if white rook is there, it's mate. But we shouldn't be we should give some credit to Argentinian players. Obviously, they saw knight takes a6, but it didn't take long to recognize that if black knight comes on e5 and stays there, it protects f7. Of course, then, white bishop could eventually attack this knight from g3, attacking this knight, trying to take over this square. But then black knight from b8, as we already discussed, comes to c6 or d7, protecting another knight on e5. And so the black construction with knights on e5 and c6 and king on g7 looks very solid. It all works. If white plays bishop e2, then we have this line, knight e5, castle, king g7, bishop g3, knight c6, and white must resign. But now you see that the entire construction of black's defensive line, depends on the ability of knight from b8 to protect knight on e5. Otherwise, it will collapse. And when you start thinking in these general terms, you just recognize that white has to develop its bishop from f1 wisely. And it doesn't matter where the bishop goes. It could go even to a6. Even bishop takes a6. And black still must play knight e5. But bishop on a6 wins a pawn, but makes little impression on black's position. There is another square that could be far more important to control. It's a square c6 or a square d7. And by thinking loud, we actually find the move that was made by all Soviet players in that game. Bishop b5. Sounds simple after we discussed all the rationale behind the move, but had a tremendous effect and definitely was not foreseen by Argentinian players. Now suddenly they recognize that the defense mechanism is no longer working, because after knight e5, bishop g3, the second knight cannot protect stronghold on e5 because it will be taken by the bishop both on c6 and d7. Then knight on e5 will be taken by another bishop, and then white rook enters f-file with decisive effect. So the three games, they took different paths. In fact, two of them were nearly authentic. So Pana didn't find anything better than taking on g5 in this position, and after castle, king e7, bishop takes e5, queen b6 check, king h1, d takes e5, queen f7, king d6, rook a d1, had to sacrifice the queen on d4, and the game was over. But that was easy. And two other games took more creativity and more energy from white to deliver the final blow and to win the game. Both Najdorf and Pilnik, they reached the same position, playing king g7, castle, and knight g6. So black knight had to leave square on e5, but white is a piece down, and it must be extremely active anyhow. So g takes h6, rook h6, rook f7. Now it looks very much like king's gambit. King f7, queen takes h6, a takes b5, rook f1, king e8, take on g6, king d7. Now it seems that black king escaped from the dangerous grounds, and black still keeps an extra piece, and it takes some imagination to recognize how white could continue its attack, creating dangerous threats. But after rook f7, knight c6, both Keres and Spassky made a brilliant move, exposing new weaknesses in black's position. Knight d5. A normal square for knight to be sacrificed in Knight of Sicilian, but it's slightly unusual in this position. After e takes d5, queen takes d6, king e8, queen g6, king d7, e takes d5. White has most likely decisive attack. Probably rook a6, the best move, but then simply take on c6, rook c6, queen h5. And one can hardly imagine that black will survive. But after knight d5, black still has time for rook takes a2. And here, Keres played h4, Spassky played h3, but both games ended fairly quickly. Black couldn't find any defense, and there is no defense. So they could probably, both players could fight harder, but I think they were too much impressed by the brilliant attacks